Now, we've seen the Harris and Trump campaigns drop a vast amount of time and money into a handful of swing states, virtually ignoring the rest of the country. Under the US electoral system, the winner of the race for the White House doesn't need to win the popular vote. DW's Amyan Esif explains why.
The US election is supposed to represent the will of the people. But does it? The US has an electoral college system, which means if a candidate wins the vote in a handful of states where the races are tight, called swing states, they can win the White House without winning the popular vote nationwide. It's happened only 5 times in American history, but 2 of those times were in the last 25 years, and polls indicate it could happen again this November. Here's how the system works. For a presidential candidate to win, they have to get the most electoral votes. Those are votes cast by state electors who represent the winner of the popular vote in each state. The number of electoral votes each state has is based on its population size, and any candidate who wins the vote in the state by even the smallest majority gets all the state's electoral votes, with exceptions in 2 small states, Maine and Nebraska. That system has led to situations like in the 2000 election when Republican George W. Bush won the state of Florida by 537 votes, handing him the White House, even though his opponent won over 500,000 more popular votes. In 2016, it happened again. Republican Donald Trump won the election with a wide margin of electoral votes, even though his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, received 2.8 million more popular votes overall. The Electoral College has tended to favor Republicans. 4 out of the 5 so-called minority presidents in U.S. history were Republicans. There has never been a Democratic minority president. One argument in favor of the Electoral College is that the U.S. is a federalist system, meaning states are meant to have a voice in national politics regardless of how many people live there.
It sometimes seems no one likes it, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to change because it is a voice for the states, and it's often felt that without that voice for the states, presidential elections would be very different. Much time would be spent campaigning only in the largest cities now.
But critics say the Electoral College has become outdated and point out that the U.S. is the only presidential democracy in the world where a candidate can get a majority of votes and still lose. There have been a few attempts to reform or overturn the Electoral College, none of them so far successful. But if 2024 gives the U.S. yet another minority president, especially one as divisive as Donald Trump, approval ratings for the current system are likely to hit an all-time low.
Now let's dig a bit deeper into that subject with the help of Lawrence Douglas. He's a professor of law and social thought at Amherst College in Massachusetts. He's also written several books about Donald Trump. Professor, do U.S. elections truly represent the will of the people?
No, they don't. I mean, in as much as we just heard in the description of Electoral College, to the extent that someone who actually loses the popular vote can be elevated to the most powerful position in government, not just in this country, but arguably in the world, suggests that the system is not functioning as an expression of the will of the people.
Now, if that's the case, what do you make of the argument that the Electoral College system is needed to give states a say in federal politics?
Well, first of all, when we elect a president, it's not states that are electing the president. It should be the American people who are electing the president. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a federated process for electing the president of the United States. I mean, the president, after all, is a national figure, not a figure who represents the interests of specific states. So I don't think that logic particularly parses very well. And, you know, consider the following. Imagine that you were creating an electoral system which, let's say, gave voters in a small state such as Wyoming 4 votes, and gave voters in a large state such as California 1 vote. I think everyone would agree that that system is manifestly undemocratic and unfair. And yet that, in effect, is exactly what the Electoral College does. It gives certain people in certain states a weightier vote in determining the outcome of who will be the president than citizens in other states.
Now, looking at history, and we've heard about that in the report, the system has benefited Republican presidents. Can you help us understand why that is?
Well, particularly, let's focus in recent history. So we already know that in this century alone, we have George W. Bush and Donald Trump being elected despite having lost the national popular vote. And because we have this kind of odd winner-take-all system in which arguably smaller states and swing states have this disproportionate ability to determine the outcome of the election, those same states simply have, just as a demographic reality, they tend to be whiter, more rural, and more conservative. And as a consequence, it just favors Republicans at this particular moment in our history.
Now, let's move on to a different subject. US Republicans have repeatedly raised the issue of voter fraud. European election observers are in the US to monitor the vote. Do you think they'll find any evidence of fraud?
Well, it's very easy to make the allegation of fraud. As we've seen, it's much harder to provide actual empirical evidence of it. I mean, we saw last in 2020, the way in which Trump insisted that only as a result of fraud was he cheated out of electoral victory. I mean, shockingly enough, he's continued to make those same allegations for the last 4 years and actually has turned willingness of other Republican lawmakers to agree to his lie as something of a litmus test of their fidelity to Republican politics. But actually, if you look historically, and particularly if you look at the last, more recent elections, election fraud is a vanishingly tiny problem in American elections. And if we look specifically at 2020, an election which, after all, was conducted in the backdrop of a pandemic, there's a lot of pressure on the electoral system. The system performed extremely well with a lot of integrity and clear fairness. And so, while we see Russia and other foreign agitators spreading lies, which find amplification in the words of Donald Trump, election fraud really is not a problem that has plagued elections in this country.
Now, the title of a book you wrote in 2020 is Will He Go?, where you rightly predicted Trump would work to overturn the election results. If he loses again, will he go this time?
Again, I mean, he's not the incumbent, so he doesn't necessarily have the same levers of power to operate in trying to overturn the electoral defeat. But I'm pretty confident that he'll probably follow much of the same playbook that he followed last time around. I would not be surprised at all if he declares victory tonight or early tomorrow morning. I think it was at 2 a.m. Last time in the last election that he preemptively declared victory. And I certainly expect him to launch, assuming again that he loses, to launch all sorts of litigation for the purposes of challenging the vote in the states that cost him his alleged victory. It's also possible that he could, whether directly or indirectly, inspire his loyalists to engage in certain acts of civil unrest.
Do you expect any civil unrest tomorrow?
It's not necessarily even tomorrow. It could be, we don't know exactly when we will get the full results of this election. It wasn't until 4 days after the election in 2020 that we actually had a declared winner, that Biden is declared winner. So, of course, I hope that there isn't any unrest, but certainly Trump has primed his supporters to engage in acts of potential violence. I mean, he has continued to issue the message that only an act of cheating can deprive us of victory. And he's also sent out the message that this country is lost if he doesn't win. So you put those two messages together, and that could be interpreted in some of his among his supporters as a license to engage in violent rejection of the electoral results.
Lawrence Douglas there, author and professor of law at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me.